Hello there! In Acts chapter 8, the Apostle Philip tells the good news of Jesus Christ to an Ethiopian eunuch. The man joyfully accepted baptism from Philip and brought his new faith back to the Ethiopian court. He thereby began the legacy of African Christianity that continues to this day, a vibrant and growing family of faith with ancient roots and fascinating history. Although the Bible does not name this man, tradition gives his name as Simeon Bakos. Join us as we explore the world of ancient African Christianity that he originated. Join us as we follow along in Simeon's wake. Episode 9, The Seed of the Church, Africa and the Legacy of the Martyrs. Today, we examine one of the more sobering legacies of African Christianity. As you know, Christianity was an illegal religion in the Roman Empire, and Christians faced persecution for their faith for about 300 years, until the Emperor Constantine legalized it in the 4th century. Now, Christians were persecuted across the empire on a sporadic basis. However, their persecution seemed to have been particularly intense and frequent in Africa. Both North Africa and Egypt received the brunt of persecution, and it shaped the concerns and practices of the church there in profound ways. If we are to understand the Christianity that took root there, we have to know more about these persecutions. We need to understand why Christians were willing to die for their faith, how they understood their martyrdom, and why Roman officials felt so strongly about Christianity that they were willing to make martyrs of them. Let's start with that last question. As I have said multiple times on this podcast, the Roman Empire's religious policy was pretty simple. You could worship whatever gods you wanted so long as you also worshiped the Roman pantheon. That pantheon included the Roman emperor himself. This was not a problem for most of the empire, but it was a problem for Jews and Christians, who were well-known monotheists and not really cool with the whole worship the emperor business in particular. In response, the Roman Empire created a literal grandfather clause that basically said that if you held the same faith as your grandfather, and that faith prohibited worship of the Roman pantheon, then you were in the clear. That meant Jews were off the hook, but Christians still ran afoul of the law. I have left it at that up until now, but you may have some questions, like why were the Romans so big on having everybody worship their pantheon? And why did Jews get dispensation to not do this, but Christians didn't? To understand why, we have to turn to a little word that had big significance for the Romans: piety. Piety is a super big deal for the Romans. It kind of plays a similar role to the word love for Christians. If you ask a Christian to sum up their faith in one word, that word is probably going to be love. And if you asked a Roman what their life and faith were all about, they might very well say piety. The mythical founder of the Roman Empire, a fellow named Aeneas, is honored with the epithet of Pious Aeneas. That is his central virtue, piety, and it's the central virtue of the entire Roman system. So what exactly is piety? Well, it encompasses a couple of things, but it all really comes down to fulfilling your obligations to others, especially your family and the gods. Now, what are your obligations to the gods and your family? Well, they're pretty big. Case in point, Aeneas starts off his life as a citizen of Troy during the Trojan War. Rather famously, the Trojan War goes very badly for Troy, and Aeneas decides that he needs to flee. But he isn't just going to leave on his own. No, sir. He goes back home and tells his dad that they need to go. Greeks are in the streets, buildings are being set on fire, there's murder and pillaging happening all around, it's just a bad time. And his dad replies, "No, son, I can't go with you. I'm too old, I'll just slow you down. Go on, leave without me, save yourself." And Aeneas says, "Not a chance, Pops. I'm with you till the end. If you're staying, I'm staying. Let's all die together, as a family." No word on if that's actually how they talked, but I like to imagine it is. The gods are very annoyed by this whole back and forth because Aeneas has a destiny. He needs to get out of there so he can jumpstart the whole Roman Empire thing. So Jupiter has a crown of flame miraculously appear over somebody's head, which prompts Aeneas' dad to ask the gods for another sign to leave, because apparently one wasn't good enough, and then Jupiter sends a big thunderbolt from the sky which convinces them to get going. In Simeon's Wake is now brought to you by Deus Ex Machina. The point of this little vignette is to show Aeneas' dedication to his family. He is so concerned for his dad that he will sacrifice his own life before he will abandon the man who gave him life. That is piety. His job is to be a good son and take care of his father, even if his father is making incredibly stupid decisions. Man, it's a good thing the Romans didn't know about codependency, or their whole system would have been shot. Now, part of honoring this family structure meant honoring the religious system they passed on to you. The Romans knew that there was nothing inevitable about society. Societies rose and decayed and collapsed all around them. Keeping a society together took effort and care. Now, part of that effort was the effort to be virtuous. Societies function better when people keep their promises, when they show courage in the face of danger, when they are self-controlled, etc., etc. Part of that effort was honoring the gods whose favor kept Rome in power. So if you failed to honor the gods, you weren't just dishonoring divinity. You were also dishonoring the generations that had come before you, who made the appropriate sacrifices and lived their lives in the appropriate ways to hold society together. In fact, it was assumed in the ancient world that older generations had figured out the best way to live. One famous Roman politician said that the older a tradition was, the more likely it was to be divine, because it literally went back further toward the dawn of time, when the gods were born. The younger generation's job was not to innovate. It was to preserve the traditions of their forefathers, which was assumed to be the exact same thing as honoring the gods. Basically, why did you worship Jupiter? Well, because your grandfather did, because his grandfather did, because his grandfather did, because Jupiter had told him to do so. Piety then boiled down to an immense respect for tradition in all its aspects. You respected the political traditions of Rome, you respected the family structure, you respected Roman culture, and you respected its gods. And that is why the Romans did not like monotheistic innovations. When the Romans looked at the Jews, who practiced a faith over 1,000 years old, they could respect it. They didn't like that the Jews couldn't worship their pantheon, and in some cases they really didn't like it. I mean, just think of the Emperor Claudius trying to put a statue of himself in the Jerusalem temple. But they could respect the fact that the Jews were carrying on the traditions of their ancestors. In other words, they saw the Jews as pious. They could not say the same of the Christians, who worshipped a man who had been executed a few generations before, and specifically had been executed for sedition against Rome. The Christians' flagrant disregard for tradition offended Roman sensibilities. They were malcontents at best, and societal cancer at worst. Christianity broke Roman families apart, because the church functioned as its own family unit. Early Christians referred to each other as brother and sister, and they cared for members of the church like they were family. And if you wondered how their biological families felt about all this, well, there were a lot of feelings. Many of them are on display in one of the two martyrdom texts we'll discuss today, the Martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicity. The text is set round about the year 203 in the city of Carthage. It's not entirely clear what the overarching cause of the persecution was in this case, but persecution was happening. The text purports to be mostly a diary entry by Perpetua. She, Felicity, and a group of other male Christians all got captured and thrown in prison to await execution. The male Christians all have names in this story, but they mostly flit around the periphery. They're not important to the plot, so I won't bother you with them. After all, this is the martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicity, not the martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicity and a bunch of other dudes who stank up the prison with their lack of deodorant. Actually, can we get a girl power klaxon for this?
Sugar, spice, and everything nice.
You got into Harvard Law?
What, like it's hard?
The story opens with Perpetua's father trying to stop her from dying. He begs his daughter to just renounce her faith and live. Note that this means that getting out of the death sentence is super easy. Even if you were a Christian in the past, all you have to do is promise to stop being one, and they'll let you out. Most Roman officials did not want to execute Christians if they could help it. But Perpetua refuses. She points to a pitcher and says, "That's called a pitcher, right?" And her dad says, "Yes." Then she says, "You wouldn't call it something else?" And he says, "Well, no, of course not." And she says, "Well, that's like me. I'm a Christian. That's what I am. I can't go by a different name." Her father did not appreciate the object lesson and threw himself at her in a blind rage. He then stormed away before he did any real harm, and Perpetua and Felicity were then baptized. Perpetua says that the Spirit told her that the waters of baptism would be enough to preserve her through her martyrdom. That promise would soon be tested. Perpetua's family was especially worried about her because she had a young child. While in prison, she is able to arrange for short visits with her daughter and mother. Her brother, who happens to be in prison alongside her, asks her if she could please have a vision to tell them whether they would die or whether they're just going to get released at the end of all this. I didn't know that you could just order up a heavenly vision on demand like that, but apparently Perpetua had the gift.
Sugar, spice, and everything nice.
You got into Harvard Law?
What, like it's hard?
She tells her brother to give her until the morning, and she'll give him the deets. Sure enough, that night Perpetua has a vision. She sees a narrow ladder ascending to heaven, so narrow that you can only go up it one at a time. There are arrows and daggers and other nasty, pointy things all around the ladder, and a big old dragon underneath it. Perpetua steps on the ladder, and a martyr at the top of it warns her to mind the big dragon under her feet. She confidently says, "Oh, that dragon can't hurt me." The dragon, who is Satan if you couldn't tell, lifts his head and grumbles, but Perpetua stays on his head on the way up the ladder, and he can't do anything about it. She gets to the top safe and sound and tastes something of extraordinary, indescribable sweetness. She tells her brother the dream, and they realize they are bound for martyrdom, and heaven after that. But her father is not so convinced. He returns to her prison a few days afterwards and decides to try tears where force has failed. He begs his daughter to have pity on him. He's an old man, and she was always his favorite, and will he really have to endure the tragedy of watching her die? Won't she think of her mother, her aunt, her child? Perpetua's resolve remains sturdy. In fact, she tells us that her father was the only one in her family who didn't rejoice in her martyrdom, which suggests that he was the only one to not have converted yet. Perpetua is then dragged in front of the local procurator, which is basically a local law enforcement officer, who asks her to confirm that she is a Christian. Her father is present and tells her not to do it. But sure enough, she says that she is a Christian. The procurator has her father beaten for this offense, probably because Perpetua's dissidence is considered to be his fault. Roman fathers were considered responsible for their daughters until they married, and often afterwards as well. Other members of Perpetua's family fare better. Perpetua has another brother. His name is Dinocrates, or was, rather. He's dead by the time the story takes place. Perpetua is worried for him because she fears that he is suffering in the afterlife. She has a vision of him, diseased and decaying, in a gloomy place. He was surrounded by water, but was unable to bend and drink it. His misery was apparent, but she felt confident she could relieve his sufferings. She began to pray for him every single day. Shortly before her death, she had another vision. Her brother was in a bright, clean place, with all the refreshments a body could want. She was certain her prayers had healed his suffering. This is a really significant moment for a couple of reasons. The first is that Perpetua appears to have saved her brother from damnation post-mortem. Lots of Christians don't even believe that's a thing, so seeing it in an early text at all is a big deal. The second is that Perpetua's intercessions as a future martyr are extremely powerful.
Sugar, spice, and everything nice.
Harvard Law.
What, like it's hard?
So, here we have a group of Christians who are assumed to have incredible influence with God, and whose prayers can influence even the fates of the dead. Who does that sound like to you? If it sounds like the beginning of the veneration of the saints, you get full credit. We don't know exactly how the early church began to venerate saints or what that practice looked like. As you might imagine, it's the sort of thing Catholics and Protestants tend to fight about. What we do know is that it probably had something to do with the martyrs. Martyrs were often seen as the closest a Christian could come to Christ. I have titled this episode The First Martyrs, but really the first martyr is Jesus. He was the very first member of the church to die for his convictions. Those who did likewise were assumed to have a surefire ticket into heaven and full access to Christ's heavenly ear. No matter what mistakes you had made, the blood of martyrdom washed away it all. The early Christian veneration of martyrs appears to have extended outward to encompass other holy people who had not died for their faith as time went on. Anyway, that was something of an aside, but it was an important one. Perpetua's story continues. Her father comes to see her a third time, begging her to renounce her faith and live. Perpetua's answer is unchanged, and Dad starts to tear out his beard in frustration. Now, this is, by my count, the third time that Dad has shown up to tempt her, a direct parallel to Satan's 3 temptations of Christ. And just like her Lord, Perpetua comes out victorious. She then has a vision of being in the arena with all manner of lion and tiger released, but they all refuse to attack her. Instead, an Egyptian soldier appears to comfort her, and a divine voice assures her that if she defeats this Egyptian, she will have the branch of victory. Perhaps a parallel to the Exodus narrative as well. At that point, one of Perpetua's male counterparts also has a vision, but he's not the main character, so I'm going to skip it. Besides, we have something far more exciting coming up. A baby! No, it's not Perpetua's baby. You remember Felicity? No? Oh, well, that makes sense. This text is called The Passion of Perpetua and Felicity, but Perpetua has been hogging the spotlight this whole time. But that is about to change. It turns out that Felicity has been pregnant this whole time, and she is worried. Not for the fate of her baby, though. Romans wouldn't execute a pregnant woman until her child was born. No, Felicity is worried that she wouldn't give birth in time to become a martyr alongside all her friends. This is quite a conundrum because babies rather famously do not arrive according to anyone's calendar but their own. Without the ability to rely upon modern medical technology to induce labor, Felicity has to rely on her prayers, but as we have established, her prayers are extremely effective, and so she gives birth post-haste.
Sugar, spice, and everything nice.
You got into Harvard Law.
What, like it's hard?
Her daughter is presented to another member of the church, who raises the girl as her own. The ability of the martyrs to immediately call forth a baby via prayer is impressive, but it pales in comparison to their greatest talent, the stone-cold one-liner. In the process of giving birth, one of the male servants in the prison decided it would be a good idea to give her some lip. He said, "Oh, you think this hurts? Wait till you're in the arena with all those beasts. Bet that little sacrifice to the Roman gods they asked you to make doesn't seem so bad now." And in a truly miraculous display of postpartum eloquence, Felicity replied, "Now it is that I suffer what I suffer, but then there will be another in me who will suffer for me, because I also am about to suffer for him." Get him, girl. After that, the martyrs are led to the arena to meet their grisly fate. The next part is structured as an epilogue. Perpetua was not able to write down her own trial in the diary, so an editor filled in this part after her death. The details of the text are as grisly as the fate they met, so I'll summarize. Long story short, the martyrs meet their deaths with profound dignity that silently condemns the spectacle of Roman violence. They're taken to an arena, and when the animals are released and begin to charge at the women get thrown to the ground and their hair gets all messed up. They then stand up and instead of running away from the animals, proceed to fix their hair. They are martyrs. This is their moment of glory. They will not meet it with messed up hair that makes it look like they are in mourning. One of the male martyrs prophesies his own death right before it happens. He turns to a Roman soldier and says, "Hey, a leopard is about to bite me and I'm going to die." Then a leopard bites him and he dies. But not before he tells the soldier to take the sincerity of his faith to heart. An incredible level of composure to have in the midst of death by leopard. The rest of the martyrs are not killed by the animals. This is not entirely uncommon. You can't always force the beasts in the arena to be as bloodthirsty as you'd want. So instead, Roman soldiers line up the martyrs to stab them to death. But Perpetua is not satisfied with this. The soldier stabs her through the ribs, but she wants to feel more pain before she dies, or at least to have some good old-fashioned agency. So she grabs the soldier's hand and drags his sword up to her throat. The writer notes that Perpetua probably did this because she was so holy that no one could have killed her without her consent. Thus ends the tale of Perpetua and Felicity. There are a few things to note here. First, these martyrdoms tore families apart. The grief of Felicity's father reflected the grief of many families who lost a child, sibling, spouse, or parent to persecution. Martyrdoms divided families pure and simple. They were traumatic experiences. Which makes the second thing all the more remarkable. Lots of people really, really wanted to get martyred. Some of them sought the assurance of salvation that martyrdom brought. Others believed in their faith so sincerely that they sought the closest possible imitation of Christ, and that meant martyrdom. Throughout the church, this created a problem. Being killed for the name of Christ was the greatest honor, but seeking out death was suicide, a sin. Churches everywhere tried to walk the thin line of honoring martyrs while condemning those who actively sought out that honor. This is one of the things that Roman officials really noticed about Christians and really made them uncomfortable. Christians were almost in a death cult, it seemed. Many a Roman official dealt with the frustration of Christians who simply would not give up the faith, even when Romans gave very reasonable terms. In fact, there's one case of a Roman official who asks a Christian just to make any sacrifice, to any god, any at all. Heck, it doesn't even have to be a god in the Christian's imagination. If the Christian could just make a sacrifice to the air or something, he could go free. And the Christian says, "Nah, bro, I'm good." It kind of freaked Roman officials out. Actually, it freaked a lot of people out. The church, as well, had to learn to temper this enthusiasm a bit, but not too much, because of course martyrdom was still an honor. That combination of suspicious, freaked out Roman officials and Christians eager to join their Lord in martyrdom produces some very odd dynamics. To see this, we need to look no further than another ancient martyrdom text also set in Carthage. This is called the Acts of the Skeleton Martyrs, and it relates the story of a group of Christians who have been dragged before the governor. It's a short story, so instead of summarizing, I'm just going to read it in full, with some interjections throughout. Okay, here's the start of the story. During the consulship of Praesens, second term, and Condianus, on the 17th of July in Carthage, there were led into the governor's office Speratus, Nartzalus, and Catinus, Donata, Secunda, Vestia. Saturninus the governor said, "You can have mercy from our lord the emperor, if you return to your senses." Quick interjection here. Consuls served for a year and began their terms on July the 1st. This is happening on July 17th, so Praesens is getting hit with this group of Christians very early in his term. Okay, back to the story. Speratus said, "We have never done wrong. We have stayed clear of treating people unfairly. We have never spoken ill of anyone. Instead, when treated badly, we have offered thanks because we obey our own ruler." Saturninus the governor said, "We too are religious, and our religion is simple. We swear by the birth spirit of our lord the emperor and offer sacrifice for his health, which you must do as well." Speratus said, "If you are prepared to listen to me, I will tell you a mystery of simplicity." Sparatus is a bold one. When he offers to tell the governor a mystery of simplicity, he is trying to evangelize him. This is exactly what Jesus tells the disciples to do in the Gospels. When they are put on trial for their faith, the Holy Spirit will tell them what to say in order to proclaim the Word of God in that context. It's a tad unclear why Sparatus calls the Gospel a mystery of simplicity. My guess is that he's riffing off of the governor, who just said his religion is simple. The governor is saying, look, just make an oath and give a little sacrifice, and you get to keep your lives. This is simple. This is a no-brainer. Sparatus, in turn, is going full youth pastor on him and saying, oh, you want to know what's really simple, governor? Let me tell you a little bit about a divinely simple guy named Jesus Christ. In Simeon's Wake is now brought to you by Youth Pastor Martyrdom. Regional governors hate this one simple trick for turning your public trial into an opportunity for offensively inoffensive humor. Just remember, no matter what he asks you, the answer is always Jesus. No connection is too tenuous, no wordplay is too cringeworthy. The governor may be able to torture you, but you can torture him with your terrible, terrible humor. Honor God the Father with dad jokes bad enough to terminate child support. And above all, let the whole world see and know that even in the throes of persecution, youth pastors can make a sermon out of it. Youth Pastor Martyrdom, ministering to youth and agonizing authorities since 180 AD. The governor senses that they are losing focus and tries to get them back on track. Saturninus said, if you're going to tell bad things about our sacred rituals, I will not listen to you. Rather, swear by the birth spirit of our Lord the Emperor. Sparatus said, I do not acknowledge the authority of this world, but I rather serve that God whom no one has seen or can see with these eyes. I have never been guilty of theft, but whenever I buy, I pay the tax, because I acknowledge my Lord, the King of Kings and ruler of all peoples. Saturninus the governor said to the others, stop being of this persuasion. Sparatus said, bad is the persuasion to commit murder, to bear false testimony. Saturninus the governor said, stop being a part of this madness. Catinus said, we have no other to fear but the Lord our God who is in heaven. Donata said, honor to Caesar in his capacity as Caesar, but fear to God. Vestia said, I am a Christian. Secunda said, what I am is exactly what I want to be. Saturninus the governor said to Sparatus, do you persevere in being a Christian? Sparatus said, I am a Christian, and all uttered their agreement with him. Saturninus the governor said, do you want some time to consider the matter carefully? Sparatus said, in such a just cause there is no need for careful consideration. Saturninus the governor said, what sort of things do you have in that case of yours? Sparatus said, books and letters of Paul, a righteous man. Saturninus the governor said, have a delay of 30 days and think things over. Again Sparatus said, I am a Christian, and all uttered their agreement with him. A couple of important things are happening here. First and foremost, it is clear that the governor really, really does not want to execute these people. I mean, imagine what would happen in a modern-day court if the defendant pled guilty and the judge said, take 30 days and see if you really want to confess or not. That is exactly what is happening here. The governor isn't worried that Christians are going to go out and harm people. He is absolutely flabbergasted that they won't follow the one simple rule that they have to follow not to get executed. So he tries every trick he knows to get them to recant. Now, it turns out his bag of tricks isn't very big. He yells at them, and then when that doesn't work, he gives them a month to think it over. Roman generals were not renowned for their gentle, empathic approach to conflict. Of course, the Christians remain steadfast, and they quietly condemn the Roman system. As Sparatus says, it's not bad to worship God, but it is very bad indeed to lie about Christians and say they are evil, and even worse, to murder them. The other important nugget in this exchange is that the Christians describe the texts they have in their possession. Books probably refers to Gospels and the Book of Acts. At several points in this narrative, the Christians have obeyed the instructions Jesus gives in the Gospel of Matthew, and they followed the example of the apostles when they're dragged before courts in Acts. They give thanks to God when persecuted and respect the state, but obey God rather than human authority. So they probably have at least those 2 books, plus the letters of Paul, which tells us something about the formation of the early church's canon and what books they have, and when, and where. As we have already discussed, the compilation of the Bible was something of a hodgepodge affair, but we know that these Christians already had access to several key books which attest to their early adoption. With the martyrs' persistence, the governor has no choice but to seal their fate. Saturninus the governor read aloud the sentence from a tablet. Concerning Sparatus, Nartzalus, Satinus, Donata, Vestia, Secunda, and the others who have confessed that they live according to the Christian religion. Because in spite of the opportunity given to them to return to the Roman way of life, they have stubbornly persisted in maintaining theirs, I have decided that they be put to the sword. Sparatus said, We offer thanks to God. Nartzalus said, Today we are martyrs in heaven, thanks to God. Saturninus the governor ordered a herald to declare his sentence. I have ordered Sparatus, Nartzalus, Satinus, Viturius, Felix, Aquilinus, Latantius, Januaria, Generosa, Vestia, Donata, and Secunda to be executed. All said, Thanks to God, and immediately they were decapitated for the name of Christ. Amen. Only in a martyrdom narrative will you find thanks be to God and immediately they were decapitated right next to each other. Which is, I think, kind of the point. In both the Acts of the Skeleton Martyrs and the martyrdom account of Perpetua and Felicity, one of their most conspicuous features is a reversal of normal power relations. Under ordinary circumstances, Perpetua would be more or less obligated to follow her father's commands. That was how Roman society worked. If you were a woman, you were either under your father's authority or your husband's. But the convictions of her faith give her grounds for resisting, and it is her father who is rendered powerless rather than Perpetua. Similarly, Roman officials do not command the sort of terror they could normally wield. Perpetua basically has to help the Roman soldier finish the job. Poor Governor Saturninus tries everything he can do to get the Christians to renounce their faith, but not one of them wavers for even a second. The martyrs hold the real power. The world may kill them, but it cannot disturb their souls for even a second. That would have been very good news for the original audience of these texts, Christians facing the threat of persecution. The mere fact that most Christians were not persecuted did not take away the fear of persecution. They were still members of an illegal religion. They could still be captured, tortured, and killed whenever a governor felt like it. That is a profoundly powerless place to be. These martyrdom narratives offered a way for Christians to flip the script. In a world of peril and precarity, they could remain firm in their own faith. They could refuse all the temptations that power offered, and in so doing, they could reclaim their own power. And they would need that because the skeleton martyrs were not the only ones to suffer such summary punishment. We can observe an identical phenomenon happening from the Romans' point of view through the letters of a fellow named Pliny. Pliny was a Roman governor active right around the end of the 1st century and the beginning of the 2nd. He was responsible for some of the Roman holdings in modern-day Turkey, including the provinces of Bithynia and Pontus, which are right up on the northern part of Turkey, and from which he received complaints about the Christians. And boy, were there complaints. As is usual when you are a suspicious-looking new group, people will compare you, fairly or not, to the other suspicious groups they know about. In the case of the Christians, that meant they got compared to the Druids of Britain and the Bacchic cults of the rest of the empire. The Druids were a bit less problematic as the Romans didn't really know what they did. They just knew that they gathered in forests and chanted and stuff, and Britain was really very far north, and it was cold and rainy, and you couldn't get good tomatoes up there to save your life, so it was probably best to just forget about it entirely. That left the Bacchic cults, which were a bit more problematic. Bacchic cults were dedicated to Bacchus, the Roman analog for the Greek god Dionysus. Dionysus, you may recall, was the god of alcohol, revelry, and excess of all kinds. Bacchic cults were known for nighttime rituals that included booze, dancing, and, let's just say a lot of free love. Now, Christians also had secret nighttime ceremonies. They often met on Sunday nights because Sunday was a working day in the empire, and if you weren't a Christian, you weren't allowed to come, which led to Romans asking all kinds of questions about what was going on in these rituals. Why did Christians call each other brother and sister, even the ones who were married? Was there some kind of incest thing going on? And what's this about eating their Lord's flesh and drinking his blood? Is this some kind of cannibal thing? What don't they want us to know? Why won't they let people who could easily have them killed come to their ceremonies? In Simeon's wake. Now brought to you by Just Asking Questions. Have you ever wondered why the world is the way it is? Isn't it suspicious that everyone you project your anxiety onto doesn't go out of their way to assuage your fears? I mean, why won't they just tell you they're not a secret race of lizard people from the center of the earth plotting to use the chemtrails to activate the 5G vaccine chips to awaken Zlogtrorp, destroyer of worlds, currently trapped in the face of the moon? Isn't it suspicious that just asking questions makes them so mad? What are they hiding? We need to know. Just Asking Questions. The socially acceptable version of paranoid schizophrenia since 100 AD. Anyway, Pliny made an investigation into the Christian groups and found that no, they weren't cannibals, they were just eating bread and wine, and no, the brother-sister thing was a spiritual metaphor. And since all the rumors were false, he and the Christians had a good laugh about all the silly things that people were saying, and then he had them executed anyway. Why? Because while the Christians may not have been free-love cannibals, they were guilty of something arguably worse. The ancient Roman vice of superstition. Which may still not answer many of your questions, because nowadays we think of superstition as like a harmless little quirk, like not stepping on a crack so you don't break your mother's back. For the Romans, however, superstition was a different thing altogether, and much more dangerous. We have to go back to the Roman religious notion of piety. You practice the faith of your fathers as a means of revering and holding on to the wisdom of the past. And you didn't do this just because you loved your parents. You did it because your ancestors had found a series of religious practices that kept the empire together. They knew what gods to placate and how often to keep the crops growing and the army victorious. They knew what rituals to perform around your house to keep tragedy relatively far away from your family. To abandon these rituals was not just to be mean to mom and dad. It was to abandon the invisible threads that held society together. One of the most common accusations we see against Christians in this period is therefore that they were atheists and misanthropes. They were obviously not atheists in the usual sense. They believed in a god overall. But they were atheists with respect to the Roman gods, and that was the important thing. That atheism also made them hate humanity. They scorned the traditional ceremonies that had held humanity together. They told their Roman neighbors that their gods were fictions, or even worse, demons who had tricked them into worshipping them. And the Roman gods were everywhere in the ancient world. They were not just the patrons of the government or the temples. If you got together with your friends to have a dinner party, you probably invoked some minor deity at the start of it to be the party's patron. If you went to athletic games, there were gods you would invoke over the competition. Ditto for the theater or the marketplace or really anywhere else you could go. Christians were rejecting all of that. Romans like Pliny thought Christians superstitious because they introduced new foreign religious practices while simultaneously abandoning traditional Roman religion. You can see this even in the Acts of the Skeleton Martyrs. When Saturninus offers to tell the governor the gospel, what is the first thing the governor says? If you're going to tell bad things about our sacred rituals, I will not listen to you. His expectation, and his fear, is that the Roman pantheon is about to be disrespected. He won't even let Saturninus continue without heading off that possibility. The Roman way of life was so sacred that to allow someone to speak badly of it was blasphemous. Other groups had some leeway. Roman officials may not have liked Judaism. They definitely didn't like the way Jews tended to revolt when their administrators failed to respect their religion. But they at least recognized the antiquity of the Jews' traditions. Like the Romans, the Jews had found a set of religious practices that had kept their society together for over 1,000 years, and had done so through times of despair, exile, triumph, and complacency. Christians had no such claim to a time-tested faith. Their beliefs were social contagion. They tore into the very fabric of the Roman social order and turned good, worshipful members of society into isolated loners who called the entire Roman project false and demonic. Now, taking off my history hat for a minute and putting on my priestly hat, hear me out for a minute. If you have a society that depends on the subjugation of other people, slave labor, violent force, and autocracy to survive, well, there are probably worse words than demonic to describe that. Like, I don't know, man, if the shoe fits. Okay, back to history. Well, actually, back to the present. Because I think the easiest way to understand Roman anxieties about Christianity is to compare it to the anxieties in the Western world about immigrants today. Many of the same fears are present. Immigrants have different values. They don't integrate into society. They are a burden on the state and commit extreme crimes. Interestingly enough, at least in the US, the data do not bear out this last point any more than they did for the ancient Christians. Immigrants to the US commit violent crimes at lower rates than native-born citizens, not higher ones. And of course, ancient Christians emphasized that they lived in accordance with their principle of nonviolence. However, the anxieties of a changing society are immense, and often different ways of doing things are perceived as a massive threat to the social order. That is why Pliny decided it didn't really matter whether Christians had committed incest or murder. Being a Christian was bad enough to warrant execution. Not all of Christianity's critics were as stabby as Pliny, though, and not all Romans were down with the idea of decapitating the harmless weirdos who lived next door. There were other critics, therefore, who had to provide the intellectual foundation for the Roman opposition to Christianity. Some of these critics treated Christianity as a philosophical school. Now, philosophy was very big business in the Roman Empire, which makes it sound extremely impressive. The reason philosophy was big business was because it was a little bit like life coaching today, which probably makes it sound a bit less impressive. What I mean is that ancient Roman philosophy was as much about a way of living as it was about complicated proofs or dudes sitting around arguing about some minor disagreement for 3 hours straight. Of course, that way of living was rooted in beliefs about the universe. So, for example, if you were an Epicurean, you believed that the gods really didn't interact with the universe at all that much, and there wasn't an afterlife, so you should just try to enjoy your time on Earth. But they also believed that pain was more bad than pleasure was good. For example, the hangover you get after a long night of drinking outweighed the pleasure of the wine. So your best bet was to spend a lot of time with your friends, have a bit of wine and cheese, and garden. Actually, come to think of it, that sounds like all my 30-something friends. Are we all Epicureans? Stoics, by contrast, believed that the universe was infused with divinity, and divinity was super active in the world, and that the whole world was organized by God's divine reason. So the world was fully rational. Everything in it makes sense. If something seems bad or weird to you, that's because you are only seeing a part of the universe and not the whole. So your job is to act in accordance with the order of the universe and to focus only on your duties. Other things may happen to you that aren't fun. You may get measles or typhoid, or lose your fortune due to unavoidable circumstances, or get stuck talking to a really boring guy at a dinner party. Your job is not to focus on any of that. Your job is to focus on what you can control, which is how you act. Anyway, those are just two examples of how a philosophical school worked for the Romans. They saw Christianity as another such school. It had distinct beliefs about the universe and how people should act within it. But according to the Romans, Christianity has some distinct disadvantages too. For starters, it relied way too much on faith. The other philosophical schools all had complicated proofs and demonstrations that were supposed to show beyond a doubt why their approach was the best, and all the other schools were dumb and wrong. This is where the two guys arguing at each other for 3 hours part of philosophy comes in. Christianity, by contrast, pointed to its scriptures as proof. Instead of relying on human reason, Christians said that God had told them what was best. Which is a pretty foolproof argument for stopping philosophers who are arguing with you. But those philosophers often enjoyed arguing, and they get mad at you when you stop their fun. Which is exactly what happened. Philosophers accused Christians of preying on the credulous and simple-minded of society. Christians would trick them with ridiculous stories and then suck them up into their cult and never let them go. And there was a gendered component to this, too. Christianity was disproportionately popular with women, including wealthy women. Part of the critics' instinct appears to have been that since women were not as intellectually gifted as men, any religion that appealed to them was probably inferior. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's weird and misogynist and gross, and it is. It's also a non sequitur. Just because Christians didn't have philosophical proofs for their religion doesn't mean they didn't offer evidence for it. That's why the Gospels talk about all the miracles Jesus did and his resurrection. I mean, why on earth wouldn't that count as proof? To which the philosophers would give two replies. The first is that just because somebody wrote it down doesn't mean it actually happened. The Gospels were written by self-admitted Christians, and there is no way of proving that they didn't just make the whole thing up. Which is still an argument people make today. The other argument, which people do not make today very much, is, so what if Jesus did miracles? Lots of people did miracles. We often forget that Jesus was not the only person of his day able to accomplish paranormal acts of healing and power. Roman people accepted the existence of a supernatural world and of spirits active within it. There were people who had learned how to control and manipulate those spirits. Those people were called magicians. Now, interestingly enough, Egypt had a reputation as a hotbed of magical instruction. And Jesus had spent his childhood in Egypt according to the Gospel of Matthew. So pagan critics could say that Jesus was just another magician who used his powers to trick people into thinking that he was a god. And Christians couldn't even argue this was impossible, because their own scriptures talked about a magician who did just that. Acts chapter 8 talks about Simon Magus, who was a magician that so impressed people with his feats of flying in the air that they called him the power of the god called Great. As a fun side note, Simon Magus shows up because he is confronted by the apostle Philip, who preaches to him and converts him to the gospel. Philip then takes a wilderness road where he encounters Simeon Bakos, the famed Ethiopian eunuch. Might there be something about Africa being said here? Philip converts a mage from the false magical wisdom of Egypt, and then sends an Ethiopian back to Africa with knowledge of the true God. Well, the pagan critics of Christianity probably aren't impressed with my literary analysis there because they don't like the Book of Acts, but that's their problem, not mine. Christians felt an increasing urgency in responding to the philosophical criticisms raised against their faith. In time, they would start writing massive commentaries and treatises refuting the allegations of pagan critics. It was important to them for many reasons. It was important for them to show that their faith was reasonable in some way. It was important for them to be able to give an account to, the powerful governors who might want to have them killed. But perhaps most of all, it was important to emphasize that the Christian martyrs had not died for nothing, that their hopes were not in vain, and that their God was sure and reliable. We'll be getting into those early apologetic efforts in a few months. But first of all, we need to take a step back, because in the middle of all of the talking and thinking and worshiping and arguing, we've come a long way. All of a sudden, we've gone from the beginning of the Common Era to the year 200 AD. It's time to take a step back and see what on earth is going on in this Roman Empire that already looks so different from the one Jesus knew. Putting our proverbial boat into its equally proverbial dock, as we stop and look at the changing aquatic landscape all around us in Simeon's wake. Thank you for listening to In Simeon's Wake, part of the Earth and Altar Podcast Network. If you liked the episode, please leave it a review and drop a like on that episode at your earliest convenience, or even before. It's nice. If you'd like to support this work, head on over to patreon.com/Ben Wyatt. That's patreon.com/Ben Wyatt, WYATT. Until next time, stay curious.